The most powerful weapon in the world is the hope and dreams of people under oppression. These words were written in a letter sent by the world's most famous pop star to history's most important political prisoner. This secret communication between Michael Jackson and Nelson Mandela has been known to very few people until now. That is, until documents from the Mandela Foundation archives have brought this extraordinary relationship to light. If these kinds of stories catch your attention, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Where are you watching us from right now? Let us know in the comments below. The year was 1985, a pivotal moment in both cultural and political history. In the world of entertainment, Michael Jackson stood at the absolute pinnacle of global fame. His album, Thriller, had shattered sales records, his moonwalk had captured the world's imagination, and his face was perhaps the most recognizable on the planet. Meanwhile, in a cell measuring approximately 8 feet by 7 feet on Robben Island, off the coast of Cape Town, Nelson Mandela was serving the 21st year of what was then a life sentence for his opposition to South Africa's apartheid regime. On the surface, these two men occupied entirely different worlds. One lived in the spotlight of global adulation, while the other was deliberately kept in obscurity by a government that feared his influence. Yet newly discovered documents reveal an unexpected connection between them, a secret correspondence that would play a small but significant role in one of history's most important freedom struggles. This connection materialized during a tumultuous period in South Africa's history. By the mid-1980s, the anti-apartheid movement had gained significant international attention, but the South African government showed little sign of relenting. The regime had declared a state of emergency in July 1985, granting itself even more extraordinary powers to suppress opposition. Violence escalated in townships across the country, with security forces killing hundreds of anti-apartheid activists and detaining thousands more without trial. In this context, Nelson Mandela had taken on an almost mythic status. Though imprisoned for over 2 decades and rarely seen in photographs, he had become the face of resistance to apartheid. International calls for his release were growing, but the South African government remained intransigent, even as global pressure mounted through sanctions and boycotts. For his part, Michael Jackson was at a crossroads in his career and personal evolution. Having achieved unprecedented success with Thriller, he was beginning to use his platform for humanitarian causes. His co-writing and performance on We Are the World in early 1985 signaled a new dimension to his artistry, one that connected his musical genius to broader social concerns. Though often portrayed as otherworldly or detached from political realities, Jackson was, according to those closest to him, increasingly troubled by global inequities and injustices. The story begins not with either man, but with a young South African musician named Yiso Masiko. A talented guitarist who had managed to leave South Africa on a cultural visa in 1984, Masiko had found work as a session musician in Los Angeles. Through a series of remarkable coincidences, he was invited to play on a charity single that Jackson was recording, not We Are the World, as is often mistakenly reported, but a lesser-known benefit track for African famine relief. I couldn't believe it when I got the call, Masiko recalled in a rare interview decades later. I was just a session player trying to make a living in LA, and suddenly I was going to work with Michael Jackson. For a musician from Soweto, this was beyond a dream. Masiko had grown up in Soweto, the massive township outside Johannesburg that had become internationally known following the 1976 student uprising. Like many in his generation, he had been politicized by those events and the brutal government response that followed. Music had been his ticket out of South Africa, but he remained deeply connected to the struggle back home, sending money to family members and staying in touch with the growing resistance movement. During breaks in the recording session, Masiko gathered his courage to speak with Jackson about the situation in South Africa. To his surprise, the superstar was not only receptive but remarkably well informed. He knew about Mandela, about the ANC, about the Soweto uprising. Masiko would later recall in a 2010 interview with South African music magazine Melody. He asked very specific questions about the conditions on Robben Island. He wasn't just being polite, he genuinely wanted to understand. This level of awareness contradicted the public perception of Jackson as disengaged from political matters. But according to several sources close to the artist, Jackson was a voracious consumer of news, maintaining subscriptions to numerous international publications and often staying up late reading about world events. His apparent detachment was, at least in part, a carefully maintained public persona rather than an accurate reflection of his private interests and concerns. Michael was intensely aware of what was happening around the world, explained one former aide who worked closely with Jackson during this period. He just chose to keep his political views mostly private. He believed his music should transcend politics, but that didn't mean he wasn't engaged and informed. The conversation with Masiko, which might have remained nothing more than a pleasant memory for the South African musician, took an unexpected turn when Jackson asked if there was any way to communicate with prisoners like Mandela. Masiko explained that direct communication was nearly impossible. The apartheid government strictly controlled all correspondence to political prisoners, and letters from high-profile international figures would certainly be intercepted. But there are ways, Masiko told Jackson. Messages can get through. What followed was the beginning of an extraordinary secret channel of communication. According to documents recently discovered in the Nelson Mandela Foundation archives, Jackson worked with Masiko to establish contact with Mandela through an elaborate network of intermediaries. The system involved multiple steps to evade detection by South African authorities. Jackson would write letters that were given to Masiko, who would transmit their contents to his family connections in Johannesburg. From there, the messages would be passed to members of the African National Congress underground, who had established covert methods of communicating with Mandela and other imprisoned leaders. This network, built over years of resistance to the apartheid regime, involved multiple layers of security and considerable risk for all participants. Messages to prisoners were often memorized rather than physically transported, to avoid evidence that could lead to additional charges of illegal communication. When written messages were sent, they were frequently disguised using codes, invisible ink, or hidden within seemingly innocuous items. The system wasn't 100% reliable, but it worked remarkably well considering the circumstances, explained Thabo Lekua, a former ANC activist who helped maintain such communication networks during the 1980s. Messages got through to Robben Island with surprising regularity. The authorities knew it was happening but could never quite figure out all the methods we used. For Jackson, participation in this clandestine network represented a level of political engagement that went far beyond the public charity work for which he was known. It carried genuine risk, not just to his commercial interests in a music industry still entangled with South Africa, but potentially legal complications under the complex web of international relations of the Cold War era. The first message from Jackson reached Mandela in late 1985. Its contents, preserved in the Foundation archives, were relatively simple but deeply meaningful to a man who had been isolated from the world for over 2 decades. Your struggle is not forgotten. Your message has reached far beyond the walls that hold you. The world's children know your name and the dignity of your fight. Hold on to hope, your freedom will come, and we will celebrate in the streets of your country. Until then, know that you have friends in places you might not expect. The letter was signed simply, Michael Jackson, American artist. According to Mac Maharaj, who was imprisoned with Mandela and later served in his government, the letter had a powerful impact. Letters from outside were rare and precious things, Maharaj explained in a 2018 interview. To receive words of encouragement from someone with such global influence, even if the letter had to be memorized and passed on verbally because physical evidence would be too dangerous, it was a profound moment. The timing of this first communication was particularly significant. By late 1985, international pressure on the apartheid regime was intensifying, but within South Africa, the situation was deteriorating. The state of emergency had expanded the already considerable powers of the security forces, and violence in the townships was escalating. For political prisoners isolated on Robben Island, news of outside support provided crucial moral strength during a dark period when victory seemed far from certain. Mandela's daily reality at this time was one of profound deprivation. His cell at Robben Island contained only a small table, a bucket for a toilet, and a thin mat on the floor for sleeping. He was permitted one visitor and one letter every 6 months, with all official correspondence heavily censored. The harsh limestone quarry where prisoners were forced to work damaged their eyes and lungs, while insufficient food and medical care took a physical toll that would affect Mandela for the rest of his life. In these conditions, messages smuggled through the underground network represented not just a connection to the outside world but tangible evidence that their sacrifice was recognized and valued internationally. The fact that such messages came from unexpected sources like Jackson only amplified their impact. What makes this correspondence particularly remarkable is that it occurred during a period when many American entertainers and public figures were still hesitant to take strong positions against the apartheid regime. The cultural boycott of South Africa was gaining momentum, but corporate and political interests often complicated celebrity involvement. President Reagan's administration pursued a policy of constructive engagement with the South African government rather than applying the sanctions and pressure that anti-apartheid activists demanded. While artists like Steven Van Zandt, Harry Belafonte, and Peter Gabriel had taken clear public stands against apartheid, many others remained cautiously non-committal, fearing commercial repercussions in a still divided America where civil rights remained contentious. In this context, Jackson's private outreach represented a significant risk. Had his communication been discovered, it could have created problems not just for those in the underground network, but potentially for his commercial interests in a music industry that was still deeply entangled with multinational corporations that did business in South Africa. "You have to understand the climate of that time," explained Gibson Kent, a prominent South African playwright who was connected to the ANC cultural apparatus. America was divided on how to respond to apartheid. There were powerful interests arguing against sanctions, claiming they would hurt the black population most. For an artist at Michael's level to pick a side, even privately, was not without consequences. The correspondence didn't end with that first message. Over the next 3 years, Jackson sent at least 5 more communications to Mandela through the same network. The messages offered moral support, updates on the growing international anti-apartheid movement, and occasionally specific information about cultural boycott efforts and benefit concerts that might have been kept from prisoners. In one particularly moving letter dated September 1987, Jackson wrote, "The world's pulse is beating with yours. Last month I performed in London, and 72,000 people chanted your name when I mentioned the freedom fighters of South Africa. The wind is changing. Your oppressors know their time is limited. The most powerful weapon in the world is the hope and dreams of people under oppression. Never surrender those dreams." This message referenced Jackson's Bad World Tour, which had begun in September 1987. While Jackson rarely made explicit political statements from the stage, he had begun including subtle references to the anti-apartheid struggle in some performances, often through visual elements or brief dedications rather than extended commentary. These moments, though fleeting, represented a gradual shift in Jackson's willingness to connect his art to specific social justice causes. Mandela's responses, when they could be sent, were necessarily brief and cautious, knowing they might be intercepted at any point in the journey outward from Robben Island. But several messages did make their way back to Jackson, according to both Masiko and documents in the Jackson estate that were verified by the Mandela Foundation in 2018. One such message, conveyed in early 1988, read simply, "Your words travel further than you know. The music continues even in the silence of our cells. We draw strength from friends we have never met. One day we will thank you in person in a free South Africa." This prediction would eventually come true, but not until years later. Another message, apparently sent after Mandela had somehow received news of the controversy surrounding Jackson's acquisition of the Beatles' catalog, offered a different kind of solidarity. "In my life I have learned that power always creates enemies and jealousy. Judge yourself by your intentions, not by what others say about you." For Jackson, increasingly surrounded by controversies and criticism despite his humanitarian efforts, these words from a man of immense moral authority provided meaningful reassurance. The secret communication channel came to an end in 1988 when Mandela was transferred from Robben Island to Pollsmoor Prison, disrupting the established network. By then, however, the international pressure on the apartheid regime had intensified dramatically. The cultural boycott was in full effect, with the Sun City project organized by Stephen Van Zandt and Artists United Against Apartheid drawing clear lines for artists. Jackson had privately declined to perform at the Sun City Resort in South Africa's Bophuthatswana homeland, a decision that aligned with his secret support for Mandela but remained unpublicized at the time. Michael was approached multiple times with astronomical offers to perform at Sun City, confirmed one former business manager. He turned them all down without hesitation, but he didn't make a public statement about it. That was his way, doing the right thing quietly rather than making a show of his principles. According to Walter Sisulu, another ANC leader imprisoned with Mandela, the knowledge that major international figures like Jackson were not only aware of their plight but actively supporting them provided crucial moral support during the darkest periods of their imprisonment. "We were meant to feel forgotten by the world," Sisulu wrote in his memoir. "Every evidence to the contrary, every whisper that reached us saying, 'The world is with you,' was oxygen to our spirits." The broader context of global anti-apartheid activism was shifting dramatically during this period. By 1988, international sanctions against South Africa had begun to seriously impact the country's economy. Major corporations were withdrawing investments, and the sports and cultural boycotts had effectively isolated South Africa from much of the world stage. Within South Africa, unrest continued despite the brutal emergency measures, making the country increasingly ungovernable under apartheid structures. As these pressures mounted, the South African government began secret negotiations with Mandela, first moving him to less restrictive conditions and eventually engaging in substantive talks about a potential transition of power. These developments were closely followed by those who had supported Mandela from afar, including Jackson, who reportedly received updates through diplomatic and entertainment industry channels. As the anti-apartheid movement gained unstoppable momentum in the late 1980s, the South African government began negotiations that would eventually lead to Mandela's release on February 11, 1990. The images of Mandela walking free after 27 years were broadcast around the world, including to Michael Jackson, who watched from his Neverland Ranch in California. Michael was mesmerized by the footage, recalled a staff member who was present that day. He watched it over and over, completely absorbed. He kept saying, "This is history happening right now. This man is going to change everything." What few people know is that among the thousands of congratulatory messages that flooded into Mandela in the days after his release was a telegram from Jackson. No longer needing to hide their connection, Jackson sent a public message of congratulations. But he included a personal note that referenced their secret correspondence. "The hope and dreams won. The music never stopped. Congratulations, my friend." This telegram, preserved in the Mandela Foundation archives, received a brief handwritten response from Mandela: "Thank you for your steadfast support through the dark years. The concert of freedom has only just begun." This exchange, though still largely private, represented a transition in their relationship from covert communication to a more open acknowledgement of their connection. In the months that followed Mandela's release, he embarked on an international tour that included a visit to the United States. During this trip, arrangements were made for a telephone conversation between Mandela and Jackson, facilitated by music producer Quincy Jones, who had his own connections to the anti-apartheid movement. According to those familiar with the call, the conversation was warm but relatively brief, with both men expressing hope for a future in-person meeting. That meeting would be delayed for nearly 2 years as both men navigated their respective responsibilities. Mandela was engaged in the delicate and dangerous process of negotiating South Africa's transition to democracy while holding together a diverse coalition of anti-apartheid forces. Jackson, meanwhile, was working on his Dangerous album and planning what would become the Dangerous World Tour, which would eventually include stops in Africa. The first in-person meeting between these two iconic figures didn't occur until June 1992, during Jackson's Dangerous World Tour. When the tour reached South Africa, a private meeting was arranged at Mandela's home in Soweto. According to those present, the initial moments were marked by a formal handshake that quickly transformed into an emotional embrace. They had never met, yet there was an immediate sense that these were not strangers, recalled Tokyo Sexwale, an ANC leader who attended the meeting. Mandela embraced him and said, "My friend at last, face to face." Few of those present understood the full history behind that greeting. For security reasons, the network that had carried their messages had remained known only to a handful of people. Even as they finally met in person, neither man publicly referenced their previous secret communications. The meeting was originally scheduled for 30 minutes but extended to over 2 hours as the two men engaged in deep conversation. They were joined by several key ANC figures, including Winnie Mandela, but for significant portions of the meeting, others stepped outside to allow them to speak privately. "It was extraordinary to witness," remembered Peter Tlodi, a South African music promoter who helped arrange the meeting. Here was Mandela, this monumental figure who had just emerged from 27 years of imprisonment to lead a nation, sitting with Michael Jackson, the biggest entertainer in the world. Yet they connected like old friends, with genuine warmth and mutual respect. The meeting lasted over 2 hours, far longer than scheduled. According to Sexwale and others present, the conversation ranged from South Africa's transition to democracy to their shared experiences with fame and its isolation. They discussed the power of music as a force for social change and Jackson's plans to help build schools in South Africa. But they also shared lighter moments. Jackson apparently taught Mandela the moonwalk, or at least attempted to, leading to laughter that could be heard outside the meeting room. Mandela tried to do it, and of course couldn't quite get it right, Sexwale recalled with a laugh. But he was game to try, and Michael was so patient showing him. It was a beautiful human moment between these two very different but somehow connected souls. The meeting concluded with Jackson inviting Mandela to attend his concert in Johannesburg, an invitation Mandela accepted. When Mandela appeared at the concert, the crowd of 60,000 erupted in cheers that delayed the performance for nearly 10 minutes. Jackson dedicated "Heal the World" to Mandela, calling him one of the world's greatest heroes, and a man whose message of unity and harmony speaks to the heart of my music. What made this connection particularly remarkable was how unlikely it seemed on the surface. Mandela, born in 1918, came from a world far removed from pop culture. His formative experiences had been in the rural Transkei region, in the legal chambers of Johannesburg, and in the harsh confines of apartheid prisons. Jackson, born in 1958, had grown up in the American entertainment industry, achieving global fame for music and dance that represented a very different world. Yet according to those who witnessed their interactions, they connected on a profound level. Both understood the burden of being symbols rather than just individuals. Both knew the experience of having their freedom restricted, albeit in vastly different ways and contexts. And both believed deeply in the potential of young people to create a better world than the one they had inherited. They were both, in different ways, prisoners of their own fame, observed Fatima Mir, a South African activist and biographer of Mandela who met Jackson during his visit. Mandela could not walk down the street without being mobbed, neither could Michael. They both lived with enormous security concerns and the constant scrutiny of the public eye. I think they recognized in each other the peculiar burden of being more symbol than human in the public imagination. Their relationship continued in the years that followed. When Jackson faced allegations of child molestation in 1993, Mandela was one of the few international figures who neither rushed to judgment nor immediately distanced himself. According to multiple sources, he sent a private message of support that acknowledged the principle of presumed innocence. A principle that had been denied to him during his own legal ordeals. Nelson Mandela understood better than most the danger of trial by public opinion, explained George Bezos, Mandela's longtime friend and legal advisor. He had been portrayed as a terrorist and criminal by the apartheid regime's propaganda. While he made no judgment on the specifics of Jackson's case, he believed firmly in the right to a fair process rather than media condemnation. This support came at a significant moment for Jackson, who found many of his industry connections and celebrity friends quickly abandoning him as the allegations surfaced. Mandela's willingness to reserve judgment and maintain contact represented a meaningful act of loyalty during Jackson's darkest professional period. In turn, Jackson made substantial anonymous donations to the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund, with specific focus on educational programs. These donations remained unpublicized until after Jackson's death, when the fund acknowledged his contributions in a statement of condolence. Michael Jackson was one of our most generous supporters during the early years of the fund, confirmed Sibanjayam Kabila, CEO of the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund, in a 2010 statement. At his specific request, these contributions were never publicized during his lifetime. He wanted the focus to remain on the children being helped, not on his involvement. The donations, which reportedly totaled over $1 million between 1994 and 1999, helped establish educational facilities in several South African townships. In particular, they supported arts education programs that brought music, dance, and visual arts training to communities still recovering from the deprivations of apartheid. Michael believed passionately in the transformative power of arts education, explained one former Jackson Foundation employee. He saw it not just as enrichment but as healing for communities that had experienced trauma. The programs he funded in South Africa embodied that philosophy. Their paths crossed again in 1997, when both men were recognized with honorary doctorates from the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. The ceremony, which honored their respective humanitarian work, provided an opportunity for a brief reunion. Photographs from the event show them in academic regalia, smiling warmly together amid the formal proceedings. Their final meeting came in 1999, during Mandela's last months as President of South Africa. Jackson was in Johannesburg for a charity concert and visited the presidential residence. By then, both men had experienced additional challenges. Mandela had gone through a separation from his wife Winnie and the difficult process of leading a divided nation toward reconciliation, while Jackson had weathered personal and professional storms that had begun to take their toll. Photographer Alf Kumalo, who documented the meeting, later described it as a moment between two old friends who had each carried heavy burdens. There was something private and meaningful passing between them that went beyond the official purpose of the visit. What they discussed in that final meeting remains private, but those who were present described a poignant moment when Jackson helped Mandela, whose hands were increasingly affected by arthritis from his years breaking rocks in prison, to put on a sequined glove that Jackson had brought as a gift. The symbolism of this moment, the fragile hands that had endured so much hardship now wearing a symbol of pop cultural royalty, moved several staffers to tears. It was a gesture of such genuine respect, recalled one presidential aide who witnessed the exchange. Michael knelt down to help President Mandela with the glove, treating him with the deference one might show to royalty. And Mandela received the gift with such delight, immediately trying to do a Michael Jackson move once he had the glove on. They both laughed like schoolboys. After this meeting, their direct contact became less frequent as both men's circumstances changed. Mandela retired from the presidency later in 1999, transitioning to a role as elder statesman and global advocate for humanitarian causes. Jackson increasingly withdrew from public life as controversy continued to surround him, focusing on his children and musical projects while making fewer public appearances. Nevertheless, they maintained awareness of each other's activities through mutual connections. When Mandela established the group of elder statesmen known as the Elders in 2007, Jackson sent a private message of support. Similarly, when Jackson announced his This Is It concert series in 2009, Mandela sent congratulations through intermediaries. The story of this unlikely friendship between two global icons might have remained largely unknown had it not been for the diligent work of archivists at the Nelson Mandela Foundation. During a comprehensive digitization project begun in 2014, researchers discovered references to the Jackson correspondence in Mandela's personal notes and in the records of those who had helped maintain communication networks to Robben Island. Vern Harris, the Foundation's Director of Archive and Dialogue, explained the significance of the discovery. what makes these connections so valuable historically is that they defy our tendency to place historical figures in separate boxes. Finding evidence of meaningful connection between figures like Mandela and Jackson reminds us that history is more interconnected than the categories we impose on it. The Jackson estate subsequently cooperated with the Foundation, providing copies of the messages Jackson had received from Mandela and confirming details of their meetings. In 2018, a small exhibition at the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg included, for the first time, documentation of this remarkable cross-cultural connection. We were surprised by the extent of the materials once we began looking, explained Lauren Siegel, curator of the exhibition. There were photographs, correspondence, personal notes, and accounts from those who had witnessed their interactions. Together, these artifacts tell a story that adds new dimensions to our understanding of both men. The exhibition drew particular attention to the contrast between the public perception of Jackson as apolitical and the reality of his private engagement with one of the most significant political struggles of the 20th century. It also highlighted Mandela's ability to build bridges with influential figures across vastly different cultural spheres, a skill that proved crucial in garnering international support for South Africa's transition. For many familiar with either man's public persona, the relationship comes as a surprise. Jackson, often portrayed as detached from political reality in his later years, rarely spoke publicly about specific political causes. Mandela, though he worked with many celebrities after his release, was selective about his personal relationships and maintained a certain reserve with figures from entertainment. Yet their connection makes more sense when viewed through the lens of their shared experiences and values. Both men had transcended the circumstances of their birth to achieve extraordinary influence. Both understood the power of symbols and performance in moving people to action. And both maintained, despite their trials and disappointments, a fundamental belief in humanity's capacity for transformation. They were both outsiders who became the ultimate insiders, observed Graca Machel, who married Mandela in 1998. Michael came from a poor family in Indiana and became the world's biggest star. Nelson came from a small village in the Transkei and became a global icon of freedom. They both knew the journey from marginalization to worldwide recognition, and perhaps that created a bond of understanding. As Archbishop Desmond Tutu noted when asked about the relationship, we sometimes forget that our heroes contain multitudes. Nelson's capacity to connect with people of all generations and backgrounds was part of his genius. And Michael, behind the global spectacle, had a genuine concern for the struggles of oppressed people that few gave him credit for during his lifetime. The story of their secret correspondence during the darkest days of apartheid adds an important dimension to our understanding of both men. For Mandela, it represents yet another example of how his moral influence extended far beyond the prison walls that contained him physically. For Jackson, it reveals a depth of social conscience and quiet activism that contrasts with the more eccentric public image that came to dominate coverage of his later life. This hidden chapter also offers insight into how social change movements operate, often through unlikely connections and behind-the-scenes relationships that only become fully visible with historical distance. The anti-apartheid struggle succeeded not just through the visible protests and public campaigns, but also through countless private acts of solidarity that accumulated into irresistible pressure for change. Big historical movements are made up of many small gestures, reflected Ahmed Kathrada, who was imprisoned with Mandela and later became a trustee of the Nelson Mandela Foundation. Letters of support, private donations, quiet refusals to cooperate with oppressive systems, these actions, multiplied thousands of times across the world, create the conditions for transformation. Perhaps most importantly, their unlikely connection reminds us that history is rarely as compartmentalized as we tend to present it. The struggle against apartheid, the evolution of global pop culture, the power of art to transcend boundaries, these narratives intertwine in ways that conventional accounts often miss. The correspondence also reminds us that behind the iconic images and public personas, both Mandela and Jackson were complex human beings navigating extraordinary circumstances. Their connection was not between symbols but between individuals who recognized in each other something that resonated despite their vastly different life experiences. When Jackson died in 2009, Mandela issued a statement through his foundation that made no mention of their early correspondence but offered a telling tribute. Michael Jackson was a giant and a legend in the music industry. We mourn with the millions of fans worldwide. We also remember his concern for humanity, especially the children of the world. Those who knew about their private history recognized in these carefully chosen words an acknowledgement of both their public connection and the more personal bond that had begun with secret messages of hope smuggled into a prison cell, messages from a pop star to a freedom fighter, bridging worlds that seemed impossibly distant yet found common cause in the universal human aspiration for freedom. Mandela, who survived Jackson by 4 years, reportedly kept the sequin glove that Jackson had given him among his personal effects at his home in Houghton, Johannesburg. According to household staff, he occasionally showed it to visiting grandchildren, telling them stories about the remarkable artist who had reached out to him during his imprisonment and later became a friend. As the final line in one of Jackson's letters to Mandela read, "History will remember your name, but I am proud to have known your heart." In this simple sentiment lies the essence of a remarkable relationship that crossed boundaries of culture, generation, and circumstance to forge a connection based on shared humanity and a common vision of a more just world. Today, as both men have passed into history, their unexpected friendship offers a powerful reminder that human connections can transcend the categories and divisions that often structure our understanding of the world. A political prisoner and a pop star, separated by continents and life experiences, found meaningful common ground in their shared hopes for humanity. Their story, hidden for years but now emerging into the light, enriches our understanding not just of these two remarkable individuals, but of the subtle, human connections that underlie great historical movements. As new generations discover both Mandela's political legacy and Jackson's artistic contributions, the story of their connection provides a bridge between worlds that might otherwise remain separate in cultural memory. It reminds us that the struggle for justice has many dimensions, that art and politics can be powerful allies, and that authentic human connection can flourish in the most unexpected contexts. In the end, as Mandela wrote in a note found among his papers after his death, we remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. For Nelson Mandela, during the long, dark years of imprisonment, Michael Jackson was no silent friend, but one whose words traveled across oceans and through prison walls to offer solidarity and hope when they were needed most.